As a discussant, we have Kate Konschnik from Harvard University Law School, and she's going to comment on the paper and add some of her own insights.
Thank you. This post-lunch slot is always a tough one, so I will try to touch on a few themes that we can maybe develop further in questions and answers. I've been writing madly throughout the morning session and throughout Sheila's presentation, so I'm hoping that there's something that makes sense here that comes out of all of this. But there's been just a lot of really great thoughts that have been raised here today. So I'm going to pick up a little bit right on the end of Sheila's presentation, and Sheila and Nathan had also sort of raised 2 points in their paper, one being that these innovative strategies are good when well matched to a particular need or gap, and that they are underutilized. And then second, something that didn't come out as much in the presentation, but I thought was an interesting point in the paper, was that we may want to look at incremental changes to existing legal and regulatory frameworks before we start something new. I'm coming at this and bringing my perspective today, not only from my current position at Harvard Law School, where I am doing a lot of research looking at how states are responding to risk, what are the variability. There's obviously a lot of you here have been doing similar work, and I've been learning a lot from a lot of the work that you've done, so thank you. And one of the things I've noticed, and the other perspectives I'm bringing here is that I was an enforcement litigator for a number of years at the Department of Justice, and EPA was my primary client. And then after that, I was environmental counsel to a senator on the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, and so did a lot of oversight work with EPA and other federal agencies, and worked closely in both of those capacities with state environmental agencies. So I'm sort of bringing the perspective of practical, on the ground, sort of how decisions are made. And one of the things I've noticed, in those 2 points that Sheila and Nathan brought out, that innovation is good but underutilized and sometimes not well matched to the problem, and that we should maybe look for incremental solutions first. It's funny, but legislative bodies are not good at either of those things. You'll notice that in order to galvanize support to do something, there tends to be this need to generate, there is a huge new problem here that we need to address, and no one wants to address a huge new problem with a small solution. So, when Hannah was talking this morning about how hard it is to find all of the code that could potentially, and statutory provisions that could potentially apply to oil and gas activity, it's because each iteration of, oh my goodness, there's been a crisis, the legislative body needs to respond, they tend to create a self-contained new program. And it may be a section that's then embedded in the existing oil and gas code or existing water code, but it is created as if it were standing on its own 2 feet, and it often is not integrated well with the pre-existing regulatory background or the realities. That's possibly just the practical, what it takes to sort of get people behind something and wanting to make a change, but it is unfortunate. And so it's, what I'm going to offer here today is that, I'd like to start first with just a couple of themes of what I've seen in sort of regulatory experience, and then kind of using those themes to draw out some characteristics of unconventional oil and gas development, so we sort of see what are we dealing with. And then just sort of make the point as we head into questions and answers that, there are a lot of really interesting innovative strategies out there, but we should probably start with figuring out what we've got on the books that may not be being exercised or enforced. Then where are the gaps that remain? And then correctly match the new innovative strategies to those needs and gaps. And then finally, always make sure that these innovative strategies have an off-ramp back to traditional enforcement. And that might be just my bias of where I'm coming from, which is why I started that way. But I think having enforcement as a tool in the toolkit, even if it's never the first one to be used, helps build integrity through the process. So you've got the good actors who are doing a really great job in voluntary programs or self-reporting programs. Frankly speaking, economically speaking, they're at a competitive disadvantage and look silly if those who are not taking that pathway or not complying with that pathway are not seeing any sort of downside to that. There's no enforcement. And so it sort of just kind of keeps the whole process moving and makes it more honest. So I had 4 themes I just wanted to point out, and maybe they're obvious, but I think they are important to start when we're having conversations about new approaches. One is that it's always easier to determine compliance and to enforce compliance when you have fewer sources. fewer, bigger sources. So, it's just, that's obvious. You have fewer sources, it's easier. You could go and inspect them with fewer inspectors. You're more likely to notice when something's going wrong. That's just an institutional reality. There's also the institutional reality that there is a reluctance of agencies to enforce against big industries or big companies in an industry. And this is completely setting aside agency capture or any sort of nefarious connotations. This is just resource allocation. This is from a perspective of a bureaucrat with very limited resources. You can either spend all those resources trying to enforce a law against a company that has a lot of lawyers, is very savvy, has political connections so that you may end up getting hauled in front of an oversight committee and have to waste time doing that. Or you could spend those same amount of resources doing compliance assistance or enforcing against much smaller parties. It's not fair. It leads sometimes to really schizophrenic enforcement against larger players, but it is a reality. So just one to put out there. 3, environmental rules traditionally have been reactive and slow to adapt to new circumstances. Part of that, Professor Richard Lazarus at Harvard has talked a lot about just the inherent problem with environmental regulation, that you are in the here and now trying to assess costs for the there and then. So it's sort of the time lapse, the geographic, the spatial lapse between having to pay today for potential environmental impact somewhere else and down the road is difficult. And so in striking that balance, there tends to be a concern about not wanting to go too far ahead of where an industry might be and impacting it too much economically, particularly when you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty and you don't know what's going to happen decades down the road. There's also that's an inherent weakness in traditional command and control, that as soon as you try to pinpoint this is where the industry should be, there's innovation that moves past that. And so you're constantly dealing with out-of-date laws. And at this point, we've not updated major federal environmental laws since 1990. So we've got, at least at the federal level, and to a large extent that also means then the state level, because much of what the states are doing is implementing federal frameworks. They're dealing with outdated statutes. So then just applying, and then the final theme is just everyone's dealing with very few resources and ever dwindling resources. And part of that is economic downturn. Part of that is, frankly, even between agencies and the state and federal government, there's been a lot of concern about, maybe more funding being taken from environmental agencies. And people were talking earlier today about how a lot of state environmental agencies are running only on fees these days, or royalties, and not getting as much funding from the general fund. So they're having to try to figure out how to make these resource allocation, inspection, enforcement decisions in an ever-constricting universe, which can be, from very traditional enforcement perspective, scary, but it also really does open up this opportunity to be a lot more innovative and to see industry and to see community groups and universities and other partners as ways of leveraging your resources and having more eyes and ears out there and coming up with some more interesting strategies of getting to the same environmentally protective place. So then just very quickly, when you look at those 4 themes, then you turn to the unconventional oil and gas landscape, where you've got a big industry, which is fairly powerful, obviously not a monolith, lots of different size players in this, but it is a big industry that agencies can have some reluctance taking on, but we're dealing with relatively small, spread out sources. So instead of 400 power plants across the country, you're dealing with tens of thousands of wells. That's a crazy combination. It makes for a very challenging regulatory landscape for agencies of all levels. There's also the combination of, a lot of the new laws in response to horizontal hydraulic fracturing have been to focus on the fracturing stage, because that's what's new and different. But this is one of these situations where not only are you having to address that new stage as a somewhat new activity, but there's also the issue of greater scale, intensity, and geographic distribution of an activity that's always been there. And so there may be pre-existing laws that worked with far fewer wells in your jurisdiction, but the weaknesses start to be shown when you've exponentially increased the activity. There's also not a whole lot of data available, which we've talked a lot about today. which can make things very challenging just to figure out what the policy response should be. And a lot of the work that I did at the Department of Justice was Clean Air Act enforcement against coal-fired power plants. And the issues were very intensive and contentious, but we were all always arguing from the same incredibly rich data source. We had in real time what the emissions were. We knew what every power plant's contracts were for coal. We knew the sulfur and mercury content of that coal before it ever went into the plant. And not having that kind of information has been sort of stunning to me, where you're supposed to begin, because there were enough big questions in that very data-intensive area. I realize I'm running short on time here, so just the two other characteristics of this particular area that's creating challenges. There's not as much federal leverage here to bring parties to the table, whether it's to come up with interesting voluntary programs or state programs, because there are more oil and gas exemptions in federal law than for other industries. And there isn't as much consumer leverage. And I did just want to make this point before wrapping up, because Sheila was not able to get to it. But chemical disclosure, there's been a big push in the last 2 years. Nearly 20 states have passed hydraulic fracturing fluid chemical disclosure laws. But it seems to me that a lot of those laws have been modeled on this sort of understanding that greater information about chemicals drives consumer behavior and therefore makes changes in the marketplace. And that's just not applicable in this situation. You don't have the consumer leverage here that you have in other circumstances. When I live in Boston, when I flip on my light switch, 60 to 70% of that electricity is coming from natural gas-fired power plants at this point. I have no idea where that gas came from, what company, what service company fracked those wells. So I can't make a decision whether or not to turn my light on based on who uses what chemicals at a particular well. And so that disconnect has made, I think, these disclosure laws a little bit less effective than the other way might be. So that would just be one example of sort of running through. I do think we need to figure out where the gaps are, match these innovative strategies to those gaps. And so in the disclosure context, I would ask, who are the end users, whether it's insurance companies, emergency first responders, public health researchers, I guess there's a whole institutional investors. Like what information do they need to make the decisions that they would make, and then work backwards from there. And then again, just to make sure these innovative strategies carry penalties or off-ramps back to traditional enforcement structures so that you build integrity into the system. I had a lot more to say, but I would love to just kind of open this up to question and answers now.
Well, let's open this up, and I'm sure that we can get more questions and more discussion. I want to thank Kate for her excellent comments. So.